Hey, how we doing everyone? It's another episode of Evolution with Glenn. This is unit number 3. Human universals. A lot of this section will include discussing things that I will use the phrase from an evolutionary perspective. So let me explain what I mean by that. From an evolutionary perspective. So when we think about something from an evolutionary perspective, we are asking the big question as to why. Why did this feature of an organism evolve to be the way that it did? Why did thorns evolve on the branches of Chinese peppercorn bushes? Why did human beings evolve to be an ape that stands straight up and down? Why did we evolve a visual system? What benefits does that provide us, or did that provide our ancestors in terms of survival and or in terms of reproduction? From an evolutionary perspective, human universals are very interesting. A human universal is a feature of a human that we find in people across the globe. There is a very big focus in the United States education system on diversity. So I like to often say that human universals are what I call a complement to diversity. Diversity is wonderful. Diversity is the idea that people differ from one another in a lot of important ways. People differ in terms of how tall they are. People differ in terms of their hair color. People differ also in terms of psychological attributes. Some people are very outgoing. Some people are very shy or introverted. Some people are very open-minded and willing to try all kinds of things. Some people are closed-minded and don't want to learn new things or think about new things. There are a lot of ways that people vary from one another, that people differ from one another. People differ from one another in terms of culture or region. If you come to New York, when you come to New York, you will find a lot of obvious differences between New York and Chongqing. You will find that we don't use chopsticks in New York. You will find that hot pot is a very difficult food to find in New York, although I know a very good restaurant that's 20 minutes from here that has hot pot. You will find a lot of differences. You will find that people always want to warmly shake hands in New York before the coronavirus. You will find that there are a lot of differences, a lot of cultural differences. The music sounds different. Foods are different. That is diversity. Diversity is a beautiful thing. But as an evolutionary scholar, I personally am even more interested in human universals. What is it that we all share? Differences are easy to spot. Differences are obvious, and differences should be celebrated. But what sits at the core, at the center of the human experience? And to understand that, we need to think from an evolutionary perspective. Because at the end of the day, we all are descendants of the same humans who led to us a long time ago. The best guess is that humans, or hominids, which is a human-like ape that stood upright, started in Africa over 3 million years ago. Asia, by the way, it is a little bit unclear, but Asia seems to have hominid fossils going back millions of years as well, which is why China has beautiful cities that are so old. We all go back to the same common ancestors, and even going back to the same human ancestors, you can go all the way back 3.6 billion years, because 3.6 billion years ago, the first life forms emerged on Earth. The best guess is that these were incredibly simple organisms that lived near hot vents at the bottom of the ocean. That's really the common ancestor of all of life. So from the evolutionary perspective, all life shares a common ancestor. And thus is interrelated. All life forms are interrelated to one another. I personally find this to be a beautiful and important idea. Charles Darwin, who developed these ideas of evolution by natural selection, used a phrase that I think is very powerful. He said this, when he was asked about his perspective on life, he said, "There is grandeur which really means beauty in this view of life." I will tell you that I agree with this statement. I think the evolutionary perspective is a beautiful way to think about the human experience and the nature of life. And I think Charles Darwin was probably thinking, because this perspective, this way of thinking about what it means to be human, focuses on the fact that all life, including all humans, are interrelated, related to each other, and share a common ancestor, going back 3.6 billion years. That's a long time. One of the things that we talked about already is that evolution selects for adaptation. And adaptations are features of an organism that facilitate the survival or reproduction of the organism. Adaptations facilitate, or they help to bring about survival, and they help to bring about RS, which is reproductive success, making replicas, making offspring. There are a lot of things in humans that have been selected that are really common across the human experience. I'll talk about a few of them here. One we've already talked about, emotions. Emotions that are often characterized in our expressions, our facial expressions, our bodily expressions, our voices carry emotions. Emotions emerge out of us and communicate to other people. Charles Darwin was very interested in emotions because he realized that emotions are evolutionarily deep, that emotions are something that go way before human evolution. The reason he thought that emotions are somehow rooted deep in our evolutionary history, meaning many thousands and thousands of generations before humans, is because if we look at other animals, especially other mammals, we are genetically close to other mammals, especially other primates, such as chimpanzees, but we're also related to cats, we're related to dogs, we're related to the entirety of life, but we're especially closely related to mammals because we're mammals. If you look at a lot of mammals, you can see emotional expressivity across various mammals. Emotional expressivity exists across various forms of mammals. The example that Charles Darwin gave, in particular, had to do with cats. Example, cats. If I were in class right now, I would say to you, raise your hand if you have a cat. I know a lot of people have cats. I read the other day that there are more than 90 million cats in the United States, even more cats than there are dogs. Darwin was very interested in emotional expression in cats. Have you ever experienced an angry cat? If not, I have a suggestion. If you ever give a cat a bath. For years, we had two cats, Dixie and Peanut, and they were cute, and they did not like getting baths. They got very angry when they were given baths. They would make an angry face, they would open their jaws, they would show their sharp teeth, they would show their claws, they would put their back up and their fur on their back would spike up as if they were really big and scary. Don't mess with them because they did not like baths and they would express anger. Charles Darwin in the 1870s published a book talking about how incredibly similar anger in non-humans, such as cats, is to anger in humans. We can totally tell when a cat is angry. We can tell when a dog is angry, right? If you have ever had a dog growl at you, you know that feeling, right? The dog feels angry, or a dog seems happy. A dog might seem sad. Those expressions, those emotional expressions, are very universal, and that is because we evolved from a long lineage of kinds of species that had emotions. Similarly, as I was talking about the other day, the emotional expressions in humans are remarkably similar. So even though you haven't yet met me in person yet, perhaps, if you see me be happy, you can tell I'm happy. And if you see me be sad, you can tell I'm sad. Even though you grew up in a different country on the opposite side of the earth, you still can feel and express the same emotions. That's because human emotions are a very basic universal. Emotional skills helped our ancestors to survive. So emotional skills helped our ancestors to survive and reproduce. That's another way of saying that emotional skills comprise an adaptation. So if you're an evolutionary scientist who does research, like me, you can look at something like that and you can ask the question, why? So an evolutionary scholar asks that question. If we see a human universal, if we see something that exists in people across the world in the same way, there must be something adaptive. So what is adaptive about it? So think about, I'm going to give you two ideas. One, the ability to accurately express emotions. So this is one part of the emotional experience, the ability to express emotions to others in an accurate way. And then two, the ability to understand the emotions of others. So this way we can think about emotion as having a communication function. Emotions communicate. They communicate information to other people. If you say something and I smile and it makes me laugh, you know that you've made me happy. You know that we've made a connection with each other. If you say something and it makes me sad or upset, then you know, whatever I did or said, that person really didn't like it. It didn't make that person feel good. Emotions have a very powerful communication function. As a way to think about that, imagine a person, and I will tell you that there are a lot of people for various reasons who don't have these skills. Imagine someone who's very bad at expressing emotions. So imagine someone that you know who is able to think and understand and is smart, but who can't really express emotions accurately. Let's say you give that person a present and that person feels really happy to have the present, but doesn't express happiness to you. Or let's say that person is really upset or nervous about something, but the person doesn't express to you that they are unhappy or nervous. That would be very difficult. That would be someone who would have a difficult time getting along with other people. Let's go to the ability to understand the emotions of others. Do you know anyone, or have you seen a situation where someone clearly has made somebody else upset, but that first person doesn't understand, doesn't realize, does not accurately perceive that that first person is upset? That's a difficult situation. Or imagine someone walks into a room and everybody is sad, and this person doesn't understand that everybody is sad, or does not realize that everybody is sad, doesn't accurately perceive that everybody is sad. That is a very difficult situation to be in. It would be hard if you're a person who's bad at expressing emotions, or you are a person who is bad at understanding the emotions of others. Life will be difficult. It will be difficult for you to get along with other people. It will be difficult for you to have a successful marriage or a successful relationship with somebody. Emotions serve a very important function. So when we ask, why is the human emotional experience so universal? The answer, generally speaking, is because emotions are adaptations that are deep in our evolutionary history. So that's one human universal that I think is very powerful for us to think about. Something else that's very powerful in the human experience that's shared is a focus on family. So number one that I'll talk about, or that I talked about, was emotions. The next concept that we can understand from an evolutionary perspective is family. Okay, I'm going to take a little bit of what I call a sidebar. We'll talk a little bit about something that I like to call the ancestral environment. The ancestral environment. Any organism evolves in a particular environment. We will focus more on this topic in Unit 4, which is coming up next, but I want to give you a little bit. I want to give you a sense of the importance of the ancestral environment. What was the ancestral human environment like? During what I'll call the bulk of human evolutionary history, what was the human environment like? This is a very important question, because when you see the adaptations that any organism has today, you are actually getting a window into what their ancestors' environment was like a long time ago. So as an example, what do we know, or what can we guess about the ancestral environment of fish? One thing that you can guess about the ancestral environment of fish living today is that the ancestors of fish lived where? They lived in water. If you take a fish out of water for a short amount of time, it will die, because its entire body is designed, shaped to live in water. And that's because the ancestors, the direct ancestors of fish today, lived in water, and they developed adaptations such as gills that could take oxygen from the water for respiration. They developed all kinds of adaptations for living in water. If you take a fish out of water, it does not do so well. Humans also have an ancestral environment. Humans, during the bulk or the majority of human evolutionary history, had an environment that was in a lot of ways very different from the modern environment. Okay, so here, let's see how well I can draw this. Here's Africa, here's Madagascar, here's Europe, here's China all the way over here, Japan, India, but here is what we call sub-Saharan Africa. To the south of the Saharan Desert, especially in Kenya and the countries near Kenya, we find the earliest evidence of modern Homo sapiens. We find tool use. They were using tools. They lived in groups. They had lots of things that were common about them. Human evolution goes back into Africa more than 3 million years. If we look at a timeline of human evolution, so this is 2020, this is today, and this is 3.3 million years ago. Which is our best estimate of when humans became bipedal, standing on 2 feet and looking like modern humans. They came down from the trees, is the phrase that is often used. There was a lot of time in Africa. There was a lot of time in the sub-Saharan region of Africa. There's a little controversy as to when people first came out of Africa. But one thing that we know is that up until about 10,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago is about when people started to grow their own food. So that was what we call the advent of agriculture. So 10,000 years ago is the advent of agriculture. Before 10,000 years ago, human beings were nomads. So what were some of the features about the ancestral environment? And you'll see I'm getting to the concept of family this way. So what were the features of the human ancestral environment? Okay, here's one. Human beings lived in small groups. Human beings before 10,000 years ago were nomads. People then could not grow their own food. They didn't understand growing rice or growing corn or growing vegetables. They didn't understand the ability to have animals to keep for food. They were nomads. And when people are nomads, they travel to get their food. And when they travel to get their food, in small groups, the group size has to be relatively small. Because if you're traveling over the mountains 20 miles in a day, you cannot bring 1 million people. It is too many people. So people lived in small groups because they were nomads. Humans lived in small groups. Probably, I'm going to put approximately 150. This is our best scientific guess as to a typical size of a human ancestral nomadic group. About 150. Who was in your group of 150? One thing that we know by looking at nomadic groups today is these groups largely included kin, or family members, and others with long-standing friendships. So, under ancestral conditions, when humans were evolving, all the adaptations that we have today, those the features we have today did not evolve for today. The features of our behavior that evolved, that we see today, evolved for the African savanna before, in this huge amount of time, before agriculture, when every single ancestor of ours was nomadic and lived in groups of 150. That's a very powerful idea to understand the universal nature of the human experience. That's true of me, that's true of you, and it's true of every person you know. That the lion's share, the bulk, the majority of our ancestors lived in groups this size. And we're surrounded by family. Not all family. An interesting thing about human evolution is humans, compared to other hominids, such as Neanderthals, Homo sapiens, which is our particular form, this is really what we call modern humans. Modern humans, or Homo sapiens, stayed close with two kinds of people. And other hominids, other human-like ancestors, didn't seem to do that. At some point in human evolutionary history, hundreds of thousands of years ago, we started to form groups of two important kinds of people: our family and other individuals who we had long-standing friendship with. People who were non-kin. People that were not related to us, but that we trusted, we came to know, and that we befriended because we can get a lot more done in a group than we can as individuals. And that certainly is part of the culture that I have seen in China, which is why I think that the group projects that I get from my Chinese students, by the way, tend to be outstanding, and I think that's because there's a very strong understanding of how to effectively work in a group, and that is a very deep part of our evolutionary history. So that's kind of a long story getting to the concept of family as a human universal. When you think about priorities, that you have priorities, things that matter a lot to you, family is always a major priority. Family is a major priority. In human groups across the globe. Family matters. When I taught in China in person for the last couple of years, I would ask students to introduce themselves and to talk about what mattered to them and what they cared about and what they were going to do after class was over. And most of the students, maybe every single student, talked about their family, talked about their mother, talked about their father, talked about their grandparents. Sometimes they would talk about a brother or a sister. And family was so obviously important. When I came to visit China, everyone there that I talked to had a very large emphasis on family. That is true in the United States also. One of the things that we care about an awful lot is our children. So we can ask this question, erasing my map a little. Why do we care about our children so much? So, you might not believe it, but to almost all parents around the entire world, the number one thing that we care about is you, our kids. I promise you that that's true. One of the biggest life-changing events is having children. One of the most important things that we do is having children. You can think back to your parents bringing you to school, asking you about your homework, asking you to do piano lessons, making sure that you were practicing, asking you to do basketball, watching that you were practicing, making sure that you were excelling and doing as well as you could, learning in school, learning math, doing your homework, learning and more learning. I know what the experience is like. Sometimes, as a child, you might think to yourself, back off, mom or dad, it's a little too much. But I'll tell you why parents care so much about our kids. We want you to eat healthy, we want you to be happy, we want you to have good friends, we want you to be smart and have good study skills. Thinking about it in terms of evolution, we can understand. Children, sometimes I will use the word offspring, are and always have been the primary mechanism for getting a parent's genes into the future. Children are number one, the primary mechanism for getting genes of parents into the future. They are, I'll put it another way in terms of the language that we've been using. Offspring are the primary way that humans achieve reproductive success. So why do we care so much about our kids? Why do parents spend so much time and money and energy and thinking about their kids? Evolution helps us understand why. Because our offspring, who share half of our genes, are the number one way that human beings achieve reproductive success. This is, from an evolutionary perspective, why mom and dad love you so much, even if they're overbearing at times. A third and final concept I want to talk about as a human universal is this: individual variability within human populations is a human universal. This particular idea might sound a little bit complex, so I will try to explain it carefully. That people differ. Individual variability. People differ from one another. Evolution's very interesting because it doesn't create organisms that are all identical to one another. Natural selection creates organisms that are similar to each other and that share some features with each other. That's how we are part of the same species. That's what it means to have a universal. But in addition to the sameness or the commonalities that people share, there are important differences. And the kinds of differences that we see between humans, the way that humans vary within a population, tends to be universal. So as an example, across the globe, or in human populations across the globe, individuals within the population vary in terms of personality traits. So think about this. In human populations across the globe, so if we are talking about people in China, if we are talking about people in the United States, if we are talking about people in Australia, what we tend to find is that people within those populations vary from each other quite a lot in the same way as they are distributed in these other countries. That is true for a lot of personality traits, a lot of ways that we behave, but it is especially true for this example of what I'll call introversion and extroversion. And when I go to China and meet Chinese students, it is exactly like my students in New York. Some of them are very extroverted, and some of them are very introverted. So here, if we think about an extreme dimension, we can have extraversion here. Extraversion means very outgoing, willing to talk to people, raise your hand immediately if you don't understand something, speak to anyone at a restaurant, never be shy, want to go out and meet people. That's extroversion. And introversion is being a little bit more guarded, a little bit less wanting to be social, not wanting to be surrounded by a lot of people, being a little bit quieter. And what we see is what we call a normal distribution. Most people in all cultures tend to be near the middle. Few people tend to be very, very extroverted, and few people are very, very introverted, and a lot of people are sort of in the middle, with most people being average. This pattern of introversion and extroversion has been documented in China. It has been documented in the United States. It has been documented in Australia. It has been documented in dozens and dozens of countries around the world, suggesting that that pattern of variability is, in and of itself, a human universal. Which, if we step back, that probably means that we have a case where being an extrovert has costs and benefits. And being an introvert has costs and benefits. Costs and benefits in terms of the ability to survive or in terms of the ability to reproduce. I'll give you a very quick cost of extroversion. If you're an extrovert, you are more likely, by a little bit, but more likely to die from an accident. Extroverts are more likely to be risk takers, and a cost of extroversion is more likely to die from accident. So that is a cost. A benefit of extroversion is that extroverts tend to have a bigger social circle. They know more people. So knowing more people is beneficial. That helps you survive and reproduce. You get more support from other people. But being a risk taker and dying in an accident works against survival and reproduction. These things balance out. Introverts. Introverts have fewer relationships, but they tend to have more very close relationships. So a benefit of being an introvert is you have some very close relationships with others. There are some people that introverts usually have 2 or 3 people with whom they are very close, and those people support each other very well. That is a benefit of introversion. A cost of introversion is the fact that they do have a smaller social circle. Than extroverts do. So they know fewer people, so there's fewer people that they might be able to count on for help if needed. Just bringing it back, this is a really interesting and I think slightly complicated human universal, is that across the globe, the way that people vary from each other inside a population tends to be the same from culture to culture to culture. Introversion and extroversion is a dimension that has been found in every culture that's ever been studied, suggesting that that variable dimension is a human universal. This has been Evolution with Learning.